There's a particular kind of fantasy drama that doesn't even bother asking, what if the main character is overpowered? It asks something nastier and way more interesting. What if the world is so rotten that even an overpowered person can't simply stroll back in and live a normal life? That's the nerve the mage from Avalon keeps pressing, and it's why I've been sitting here on Flick Flare thinking about it long after the obvious fireworks are done. And look, before we get deep into it, if you like this kind of long, story and character-forward breakdown, hit subscribe. No pressure, just helps the channel find the people who actually want to talk about the messy stuff under the magic. Also, I'm going moderate on spoilers today, meaning I'll talk about the big setup beats and the emotional turning points that are already baked into the premise. But I'm not here to blow up any endgame reveals or late-game twists. The hook of this story is so clean, you can almost hear the writers sharpening the knife. Aldric spends 12 years training in isolation on a remote island, comes back to civilization, and his first official order of business is not save the kingdom, not take the throne, not avenge the fallen master. It's I'm terminating an arranged marriage contract I never wanted. I love that. I love that the story starts by framing his power as irrelevant to the most human problem imaginable. Other people deciding your life for you and expecting you to smile about it. And it's not presented like a quirky side quest either. The arranged marriage contract with House Alvin feels like the kind of political leash that's been quietly tightening for years while Aldric was away becoming immense and unparalleled. The word unwanted does so much heavy lifting here because it's not just romance he's rejecting, it's ownership. It's an entire system saying, you're a resource, you're a name, you're a bargaining chip. So when he returns to officially end it, that isn't petty. That's war, just dressed up in paperwork. Here's the first rehook that got me. The show doesn't let him even get his footing. The homecoming is immediately dangerous. There's a lethal assassination attempt. And I don't mean someone takes a shot and misses because the hero is cool. The vibe is more like the world has already made a decision about him. Aldric's not back for a day before somebody tries to erase him from the board. That's such a clarifying kind of welcome party, because it tells you that his power is not a shield from politics, it's a magnet for it. What hit me emotionally, though, is the way the story makes room for Aldric's instinct to help even when it would be smarter to disappear. After surviving that attempt on his life, he uses his advanced arcane mastery to purge a mysterious shadow curse from a dying stranger. That detail matters. It reframes him immediately. He's not returning like some smug demigod who's excited to finally show off. He's returning like a person who has spent 12 years alone with his own thoughts and his own discipline. And the first time he finds someone in pain, he acts. And I need to slow down here, because this is where the series quietly tells you what kind of mage Aldric is. Anyone can be written as powerful. Immense reservoir, unparalleled, blah blah. Those are resume words. But choosing to purge a shadow curse from a dying stranger, someone who, on paper, offers him nothing, says his power is tethered to a principle. And the principle isn't, I protect my own, or I protect the innocent when it's convenient. It's more like, if I can do something and I don't, I'm not the man I trained to be. That's a scarier kind of morality, because it means he'll keep doing the right thing even when it costs him. If you've watched a lot of fantasy dramas, you already know the usual rhythm. The hero returns, meets the friends, gets dragged into a bigger plot. The mage from Avalon does that too, but it does it with a surprisingly sharp emotional pivot. Aldric seeks a brief moment of peace, reunites with his childhood friends, Tessa and Duncan, at a local tavern. And the word brief is almost funny in hindsight, because the story clearly has no intention of letting him rest. This reunion is one of those setups that can go corny fast. And what I appreciated is that it doesn't lean on look how cute their childhood was nostalgia. It leans on the ache of time. 12 years is a long time to be gone. And even if you come back with Gautier magic, you don't come back with the right to pick up where you left off. So just the idea of Aldric walking into a tavern, after isolation, after assassination, after literally pushing shadow out of someone's body and trying to talk like a normal human being again. That's not a victory lap. That's vulnerability. Let me paint you the mini scene the way it plays in my head, because this is where the show's emotional engine kicks in. You can practically taste the tavern air, old wood soaked with spilled ale, smoke clinging to the ceiling, the low hum of people trying to forget their lives for an hour. Aldrich steps in, and he's carrying that weird stillness some trained people have. Like even when they relax, they're not fully relaxing. Then he sees Tessa and Duncan, and for a second there's that micro-freeze, that little stutter in the body where your brain is trying to overlay the memory of someone onto the person they are now. There's warmth, yes, but it's complicated warmth. Like touching a scar and realizing it doesn't hurt the way it used to, but you still remember when it did. And then the whole room's temperature changes because the tyrannical Baron Dubban arrives with mercenaries, and suddenly that tavern stops being a place and becomes a test. This is where I think the show makes its loudest statement, and it's not even about magic. The Baron and his mercenaries attempt to forcibly abduct the women inside. Not harass. Not threaten. Abduct. The language is blunt, and the story treats it with the seriousness it deserves. There's no cheeky villain flirting. It's predation with a title and paid muscle. And the worst part is how normal it is to everyone else in the room. Because here's the detail that made my stomach drop. The local nobles cower in fear. They dismiss Aldrich as a nobody. That dynamic is so real it's uncomfortable. Power doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a room full of people trained to look away. The nobles are the ones who are supposed to represent order, and they're useless. They're scared or complicit, or both. And when Aldrich, this returning figure with an entire storm of power behind his ribs, refuses to back down, he's not just fighting mercenaries. He's defying an agreement everyone else made with themselves. If it's not happening to me, I'll survive by staying quiet. If you want the clean fantasy version, Aldrich is the hero who stands up to tyranny. But the show's framing is harsher. Aldrich is the person who disrupts the comfort of bystanders. And that's why they dismiss him. Not because they truly think he's a nobody, but because calling him nobody is a way to keep their own cowardice from being named. And I'm going to give you a slightly contrarian take here, because the obvious reading is the nobles are pathetic, Aldrich is righteous. End of story. I don't think it's that simple. And I actually think the show is smarter if you don't flatten it. Those nobles covering aren't just there to be punchlines. They're there to show what tyranny does to a community over time. A tyrannical baron doesn't get that comfortable abducting women in public unless an entire system has trained people that resistance is suicidal or futile. The cowardice is ugly, yes, but it's also learned behavior. And Aldrich walking in with the ability to erase a room full of mercenaries is almost unfair in a way. Not morally unfair, he should stop it. But narratively, it raises the question. What does it mean to be brave if you've never been given the tools to win? That question is the real meat of the Mage from Avalon for me. Not can Aldrich beat them, because with the premise we've been handed, immense and unparalleled power, advanced arcane mastery, massive reservoir, he probably can. The tension is what kind of world requires someone like Aldrich to make basic safety possible. There's also something deliciously grounded about how Aldrich's return isn't celebrated. In a lot of stories, the long-lost prodigy comes home and everyone's like, "We always believed in you." Here, he comes home and immediately gets targeted, used, dismissed, tested. That's closer to real life than fantasy likes to admit. People don't throw you a parade when you come back changed. They try to fit you back into the box they kept for you. And if you don't fit, they call you arrogant, dangerous, or inconvenient. Which brings us back to that arranged marriage contract with House Alvin. Because you can feel the thematic connection. The same society that allows a baron to abduct women in public is the society that thinks it can bind Aldrich to a marriage contract like he's livestock. Different flavors of entitlement, same root. What I appreciated, structurally, is how the story stacks these conflicts like weights. There's personal conflict, Aldric's autonomy, and the marriage contract. There's physical danger, the assassination attempt. There's moral conflict, saving a cursed stranger. And then there's communal conflict, the tavern abduction attempt, the noble's cowardice, the baron's tyranny. Each one escalates the stakes in a different direction. It's not just bigger monster, bigger spell. It's more pressure on Aldric's values. Because if Aldric is as powerful as the story says, he could solve a lot with violence. He could make examples. He could become the new terror. And that's what makes his restraint, or even his choice of when to unleash devastation, so important. The storyline tells us he prepares for a devastating magical confrontation to protect his friends and uphold his principles. That last clause is key. Protecting his friends is expected. Upholding his principles is a choice. And it's a choice that will shape what kind of legend he becomes. Here's a personal confession. And I'm saying this as someone who's watched an embarrassing amount of Chosen One Returns content. I'm tired of invincible protagonists who only struggle because the plot needs 20 episodes. I'm tired of fake tension where the hero is godlike, but keeps getting surprised by basic betrayal. So I went into this with my guard up. And what genuinely got under my skin, in a good way, is that the mage from Avalon seems less interested in tricking you into thinking Aldric might lose a fist fight, and more interested in making you feel the loneliness of being the only person in the room willing to act. That loneliness is its own kind of danger. It's the danger of becoming a blunt instrument. It's the danger of deciding that if no one else will protect the vulnerable, you'll do it yourself, and then slowly realizing you're building a world where you are the only safety net. That's a heavy burden for anyone, let alone someone who just spent 12 years isolated on an island learning to control power that could ruin cities. And yes, I'm going to be a little self-aware for a second. Every time a fantasy drama introduces a remote island and 12 years of training, a part of my brain goes, okay, so we're doing the socially undercooked protagonist thing where he doesn't understand tavern etiquette. And the show could absolutely lean into that in a cringy way. But with what we are given, the more compelling angle is that Aldric's isolation wasn't cute. It was grueling. It was formative. It likely taught him discipline, but it also likely robbed him of the daily practice of being around people. So when he returns, the challenge isn't can he talk to humans, it's can he reconnect with them without treating them like fragile glass or like obstacles? That's where Tessa and Duncan matter, even in the small amount we know. They aren't just friends for banter. Childhood friends in a story like this are the last living link to who Aldric was before power became his main identity. They can call him out in a way strangers can't. They can remind him that he's not just a weapon. And the fact that their reunion is violently disrupted by Dubin's mercenaries is brutal because it's basically the story saying, you don't get to have your past back without a fight. Now, since this is a drama review, I want to talk about performance because the writing alone doesn't sell this premise. You need an actor playing Aldric who can carry silence. Immense power is the easiest thing to overplay. If you puff your chest and speak in gravelly prophecy voice, congratulations, you've become every generic mage who ever stared into a candle. The better choice, and the choice this kind of story demands, is restraint. The sense that Aldric is constantly measuring himself. Not because he's scared, but because he knows what he could do. The most effective version of Aldric, for me, is someone who doesn't look hungry for domination. He looks tired of people testing him. He looks like someone who came back to do one clean thing, terminate a contract, and instead keeps being forced into moral emergencies. If the performance leans into that quiet frustration, that simmering why is this world like this, then the tavern confrontation doesn't just become an action beat. It becomes a breaking point. And for Tessa and Duncan, the chemistry has to feel lived in, not scripted. There's a special kind of intimacy between people who shared a childhood before life got sharp. It's not constant hugging and declarations. It's shorthand. It's inside jokes that don't need explaining. It's the ability to argue without fearing abandonment. And it's also the subtle grief of realizing you don't fully know each other anymore. If the show nails that, then the violence interrupting their reunion lands like an insult, not just a threat. Let's talk about Baron Dubin for a second, because tyranny in fantasy can be lazy. You slap on a title, give him mercenaries, make him snarl, call it a day. What makes Dubin's presence effective, based on what we're told, is how public it is. He's not abducting women in a shadow alley. He's doing it in a tavern, with witnesses, with nobles present. That tells you he doesn't fear consequences. He's normalized harm. And that's why the nobles' reaction matters so much. Their covering is world building. It tells you the social contract is already broken. The law is a costume the powerful wear when it serves them. In that kind of environment, Aldric terminating an arranged marriage contract isn't just a personal act. It's a refusal to participate in a culture where people, especially women, are treated as property. There's a thread here about consent and autonomy that I think the show is setting up very intentionally. The arranged marriage contract is about controlling Aldric's future. The abduction attempt is about controlling women's bodies. The shadow curse, depending on how it's framed, feels like another violation, something invading and consuming a person without permission. These aren't random plot beats. They rhyme. They point to a world where power is routinely used to override the will of others. And then you place Aldric in the center. Someone with the power to override everyone, choosing instead to use his power to restore agency, to remove a curse, to stop an abduction, to end a contract. If that's the thematic spine, then the unparalleled power isn't there for spectacle. It's there to test whether power can exist without entitlement. Here's another rehook, because this is where I started leaning forward. If Aldric can crush Dubin's mercenaries, what happens after? Not plot-wise. Again, I'm not inventing an ending, but morally. What's the cost of being the only person willing to escalate? Does the town start relying on him like a crutch? Does he become a symbol that attracts more violence? Does House Alvin see his defiance as an opportunity to paint him as unstable? The storyline already tells us people dismiss him as a nobody. That dismissal can flip into fear real fast once he proves he isn't. And that flip, nobody to threat, is one of my favorite social dynamics in stories like this when it's done with nuance. Because the same people who laughed at you will later insist they always knew you were dangerous. It's a way to rewrite their own shame into self-protection. We didn't ignore the problem. We were cautious of the monster. That's how societies justify oppression, and it's exactly the kind of ugliness a drama like this can explore if it keeps its nerve. On the craft side, what makes these themes land is pacing and breadth. The storyline gives us a sequence that could easily feel like a speedrun. Training ends, return, assassination attempt, curse purge, tavern reunion, mercenary abduction attempt, confrontation. That's a lot. So the show's success, for me, depends on whether it gives each beat emotional oxygen. Not necessarily slow scenes, but scenes that let consequences register in faces. The moment after an assassination attempt where your hands are still shaking, even if you won. The moment after purging a curse where you realize you just used a piece of yourself on a stranger. The moment when Tessa and Duncan look at Aldric and realize he's not the boy who left. That's where sound and atmosphere become storytelling tools, too. Not in a listen to this epic score way, but in the way a room can feel oppressive when people are holding their breath. A tavern can be warm until it isn't. The clink of a mug can sound normal until it sounds like the last casual sound before violence. If the show understands that, it can make the confrontation feel inevitable without feeling forced. And I want to highlight something. The devastating magical confrontation line can be a trap. Because devastation is easy. A big blast is easy. What's hard, and what separates a forgettable fantasy drama from one that actually sticks, is making devastation feel like a consequence, not a flex. If Aldric unleashes power, I wanted to feel like the story understands the weight of that decision. I wanted to feel like the air changes, like there's a point of no return, like everyone in the room realizes they're watching something that will be talked about for years. But again, the trick is, you don't need to show me 100 spells. You need to show me one decision. And I keep coming back to the Shadow Curse because it's the most quietly intriguing piece of the setup. Mysterious Shadow Curse is doing a lot of toner work. Shadow magic, curses, dying stranger. It suggests a threat that isn't just political. It suggests something invasive, maybe organized, maybe spreading. And Aldric purging it implies he's not just strong, he's skilled at a kind of magic that requires precision. Purging is not the same as blasting. Purging implies understanding. It implies you can separate the person from what's poisoning them. That makes Aldric feel less like a walking nuke and more like a surgeon with a hurricane trapped in his chest. So when the nobles dismiss him as a nobody, it's almost comical, but not in a haha, they're dumb way. It's comical in the bleak way humans are comical when they cling to their hierarchies even as the floor collapses. They look at clothes, titles, family names, and they decide who matters. Meanwhile, the person who actually matters in that moment, the person with the ability and the will to stop what's happening, is being socially erased in real time. There's a specific kind of anger that comes from watching that, and I felt it. I felt that old familiar burn-off. Of course, you're ignoring the person doing the right thing because it doesn't fit your script. And I think that's why Aldric resonates as a protagonist, even if you're allergic to OP main character setups. Because the fantasy isn't just that he's powerful. The fantasy is that someone finally says no. Someone finally refuses to play along. Now, I do want to be fair. Stories like this can also drift into wish fulfillment in a way that's a little too clean. One powerful guy shows up and fixes what everyone else tolerated. That can accidentally become a story that insults the very community it's trying to save by implying they were weak rather than trapped. The reason I'm hopeful here, based on the premise elements we have, is that the story already shows the social texture. The noble's cover. The Baron is tyrannical and public. The abduction is attempted openly. That's a system problem, not just a villain problem. And Aldric's first goal is personal autonomy, not heroism. Those choices suggest the writers are thinking in systems, not just in punchable faces. Still, the show will have to earn it. Because once Aldric steps into that tavern conflict, the question becomes, is he protecting people? Or is he replacing one form of power with another? He wants to uphold his principles. Great. But principles can curdle into righteousness if you're the only one with the power to enforce them. And that's where Tessa and Duncan become more than sentimental anchors. They can function as moral mirrors. Childhood friends don't just remind you of who you were. They also have the leverage to ask, who are you becoming? If Aldric's power starts pulling him toward a lonely, punitive worldview, I'll handle it. Stand back. Then the healthiest thing the story can do is let those relationships complicate him. Because the worst version of this genre is the one where everyone around the protagonist becomes a fan club. The best version is where the protagonist's power puts strain on intimacy, where people love him and still fear what he could do, where he wants peace and keeps attracting war, where he's right and still has to pay. One more self-aware aside, because I can't help myself. Anytime a fantasy baron shows up with mercenaries, my brain starts assigning them all the same face, like they were ordered in bulk. You know the type. Permanent scowl. Armor that looks expensive, but somehow always dirty. They move like they've never had to ask permission for anything in their lives. What makes them effective isn't individuality, it's what they represent. They represent the idea that violence is a service you can hire. And that's why Aldric standing against them matters, even if he's stronger. Because it's not one man versus many. It's one set of values versus a paid machine. This is also where the title The Mage from Avalon starts to feel like more than a cool fantasy label. From Avalon carries a mythic echo. It suggests distance, legend, the place you go to become something else. But Aldric isn't returning from Avalon as a myth. He's returning as a person trying to end a marriage contract and have a drink with his friends. The tension between myth and personhood is basically the whole story. People will project onto him. They'll want him to be savior, threat, tool, spectacle. He's trying to be a man with a choice. And when the Baron's mercenaries try to abduct the women inside, it forces Aldric to answer a question he probably wanted to postpone. What does it mean to come back and see your home as it really is? Not the home you remember. The home that has been living without you, shaping itself around cruelty. Because I'm telling you, that's the cruelest thing about return stories. It's not just that you changed. It's that you have to accept the possibility that the place you missed didn't miss you back. The nobles didn't become braver in your absence. The tyrant didn't get kinder. Your friends might be surviving in ways you don't understand. And then you show up with all this power and all this conviction, and you realize you can't rewind time. You can only decide what to do next. So when Aldric prepares for that devastating magical confrontation, the moment isn't just hype. It's grief. It's disappointment. It's anger. It's protection. It's the collision of 12 years of discipline with a world that still thinks it can drag people out of a tavern like their objects. And if the show is really doing what I think it's doing, it's also setting up a very uncomfortable truth. Once you intervene publicly, you become part of the story, whether you like it or not. You don't get to be anonymous anymore. You don't get to be just a guy ending a contract. Every noble who covered will remember you. Every mercenary will tell a story about you. Every victim will wonder if you'll come back next time. Power creates expectations, and expectations are chains in their own way. Here's the next rehook, and it's the one that made me trust the drama element as much as the fantasy element. Aldric isn't only being tested by villains. He's being tested by the community's reaction to villainy. It's one thing to fight a tyrant. It's another thing to fight the quiet agreement that keeps tyrants safe. And that's where the nobody dismissal cuts the deepest. Because it's not only arrogance. It's self-defense. If Aldric is a nobody, then the nobles don't have to reckon with why they didn't stand up. If Aldric is a nobody, then his courage is an anomaly, not a mirror. If Aldric is a nobody, then their inaction stays unchallenged. But of course, he's not a nobody. He's a man who survived a lethal assassination attempt, who can purge a shadow curse, and who is willing to put himself between predators and their prey. The irony is almost cruel. The people who most need someone like Aldric are the same people trained to diminish him until he's useful. That's why I'm not even mainly excited about the magic. I'm excited about the social fallout. I'm excited about the way House Alwyn's contract termination might intersect with this public stand against Avalon. Because if Aldric is challenging one powerful house and humiliating another powerful figure's authority in a tavern, you're basically watching a man step on multiple landmines with calm eyes. And you can tell the story is building toward a confrontation that isn't just spellcraft. It's identity. It's reputation. It's narrative control. Who gets to define what Aldric is? A weapon? A hero? A threat? A groom? A problem to be eliminated? One more thing I want to linger on is the choice to include that dying stranger early. Stories often reserve healing acts for later, after the hero is already beloved, as proof they're good. Here, the stranger comes before the tavern hero moment. That sequencing matters because it implies Aldric's morality isn't performative. He didn't save someone because people were watching. He saved someone because he couldn't not. Then, later, when people are watching in the tavern, the story has already shown us the private version of Aldric. It makes the public stand feel consistent, not staged. And if you're a newcomer to this drama, and you're wondering whether it's just going to be Aldric vaporizing bad guys for hours, that little detail should give you some hope. Purging a curse is intimate. It's hands close, breath close, consequence close. It's the kind of magic that forces a character to confront suffering up close rather than at a distance. It also adds a little horror edge to the world. A shadow curse suggests corruption, invasion, maybe something parasitic. Even if the show doesn't lean full horror, it gives the fantasy a bruise. It's not shiny. It's sick. And Aldrich being able to remove it doesn't make it less scary. It makes it more ominous, because now you're wondering how widespread it is, where it came from, and why someone would use it in a world already ruled by petty tyrants. Because that's the thing. When a world has both political cruelty and supernatural corruption, it tends to mean the cruelty is going to make the corruption easier to spread. Fear makes people desperate. Desperation makes them bargain. Bargains make them vulnerable. And suddenly your arranged marriage contract isn't just a social issue. It's a pressure point villains can exploit. I'm not saying the show definitely goes there. I'm saying the ingredients are there, and the premise is strong enough to support that kind of layering. And speaking of layering, the title of House Alwyn being described as arrogant is a simple descriptor, but it's telling. Arrogance in a powerful house often means entitlement disguised as tradition. This is how it's always been. This is what's proper. This is what you owe us. And it's the exact mindset that would see a mage like Aldrich as a tool to be bound rather than a person to be respected. So when Aldrich returns to terminate that contract, he's not only rejecting a marriage. He's rejecting the idea that his power belongs to their lineage plan. Now, if the show plays fair, terminating that contract won't be a clean signature on a page. It'll be a social rupture. It'll have consequences, whispers, threats, political maneuvering. And the assassination attempt already tells us someone is willing to escalate to murder to keep Aldrich contained or erased. That's not romantic drama. That's power struggle. And that's where I want to end this stretch of the conversation for now, right in the tension where the tavern becomes more than a tavern and Aldrich's return becomes more than a return. Because the story is positioning him at the intersection of personal autonomy, public violence, and the kind of moral pressure that can turn even a principled person into something harder if he's not careful. The pressure point the drama keeps leaning on is that Aldrich's principles aren't abstract. They're not something he gets to talk about in a candlelit library while someone else bleeds in the background. They're being dragged out into the open, in a room full of witnesses who have trained themselves not to witness anything. And the second you frame it like that, you realize the confrontation in the tavern isn't just a fight scene waiting to happen. It's a referendum on what kind of adult Aldrich became during those 12 years, and whether that adult is capable of living among people again without either breaking them or abandoning them. Because let's be honest about what immense and unparalleled power usually does to a story. It tempts the writing into shortcuts. Why negotiate? Why persuade? Why investigate? Why wait? When the protagonist can just end the problem? The mage from Avalon gets around that temptation, at least in the way the setup is engineered, by making the problem not a single opponent, but a whole social behavior. You can't blast a community into having a spine. You can't fireball a room into respecting women's autonomy. You can't thunderstorm a noble into becoming brave. If anything, raw power tends to make that worse, because then everyone just waits for the powerful person to handle it, and their moral muscles atrophy even more. And that's the first thing I want the show to keep wrestling with. The difference between saving someone and changing the conditions that made them unsafe. Aldrich can protect his friends in that moment. He can stop the abduction attempt. But the show has already told us the Baron is tyrannical. Tyranny isn't a one-night inconvenience. It's a pattern. So the question becomes, is Aldrich stepping into a pattern he's willing to keep confronting? Or is he about to learn that one heroic stand doesn't automatically become a better world? Here's where the writing choice of bringing in Tessa and Duncan becomes quietly strategic, because they anchor the stakes in something that isn't cosmic. If the tavern violence were only about nameless victims, the show could drift into that fantasy trope where the protagonist defends the people as a concept. But when the people in the room include his childhood friends, the conflict gets personal in a grounded way. Aldrich isn't defending an idea. He's defending faces he recognizes, histories he's part of. It forces him to be emotionally present. And emotional presence matters when you're writing a character like this. Aldric the Unstoppable is boring. Aldric the Unstoppable, who still flinches internally when his past gets threatened, is a person. Every time the story reminds you that he trained for 12 years in isolation, I think you're supposed to feel two things at once. First, oh, he paid a price, and it made him extraordinary. Second, concern, isolation isn't neutral. It shapes your ethics. It can make you rigid. It can make you too comfortable with your own judgment because you haven't had to compromise with anyone for a long time. When you're alone, you never have to be wrong out loud. You never have to apologize. You never have to navigate someone else's fear of you. So if Aldric is returning with principles, those principles might be incredibly pure, and purity can be dangerous. Not because doing the right thing is bad, obviously, but because doing the right thing without understanding how fragile people can be under terror can lead you into choices that are technically moral and still emotionally catastrophic. And this is where I'm going to say something that might sound like I'm nitpicking, but it's actually the heart of the drama for me. The story needs Aldric to notice the bystanders, not just the villains. It needs him to read the room. If he's truly wise, he'll see that the nobles dismissing him as a nobody aren't just insulting him. They're revealing the kind of fear-based social choreography they live inside. If he's truly principled, he'll want to protect the women being targeted. If he's truly powerful, he might be tempted to punish everyone who stood by. And those are three different impulses that can't all be satisfied cleanly. If the show can put Aldric in that moral bind where there's no outcome that feels fully clean, then you've got drama that lasts beyond a single confrontation. Let me rehook you with this, because it's the thought that kept nagging at me. What if Aldric's biggest enemy isn't the Baron at all, but the way power reorganizes everyone's behavior around him the moment he reveals what he can do? There is social physics to someone like Aldric walking into a tavern. Before he acts, he's a nobody. After he acts, he becomes gravity. People start orbiting him. For safety, for favors, for vengeance, for prestige, for fear. And if he's not careful, every interaction turns transactional. That's how legends get lonely. Now, since we're doing a drama review, and not just a plot vibes chat, I want to talk about how you film a character like Aldric so the power feels like something, not just a special effects budget flex. The strongest fantasy adaptations understand that magic is cinema, not fireworks. It's timing, it's restraint, it's negative space. It's what the camera chooses not to show. If the mage from Avalon is doing it right, the devastating confrontation isn't shot like a video game ultimate. It's shot like an escalation you can't take back. You build the room first. You build the fear. You show the mercenaries' confidence, the baron's entitlement, the woman's dread, the noble's silent bargaining with themselves. And then you show Aldric making a decision. The moment of decision is the special effect. The light and sound are just the language you use to express it. And sound design specifically can make or break devastation. A show can spend a fortune on visuals and still feel weightless if the sound is generic. But if the sound is intimate, if you hear the air pressure shift, if the magic has a texture, if there's a low-frequency hum that makes the tavern feel like it's vibrating from the inside, then the audience feels the consequence in their chest. That's how you make magic feel real without needing to show 1,000 different spells. The storyline mentions Aldric's immense magical reservoir. And I'm always wary of that kind of phrasing because it can turn into infinite mana nonsense where the hero can do anything at any time. The more interesting interpretation is that reservoir is not only quantity but containment. A reservoir is something you manage. It can overflow. It can drown a village if the dam breaks. So the best way to portray Aldric's power is to make it feel like something he is actively holding back all the time. That creates tension even when he's not threatened. Not will he win, but will he lose control? Not in a cheap rage way, but in the human way where you're exhausted and pushed, and you choose a level of force that you'll regret later, even if you were justified. And that's why I hope the show's editing rhythm doesn't rush past the moments after his actions. One of the biggest problems in fantasy drama is that it treats consequences like scene transitions. Big moment happens, then we're on to the next plot point. But if Aldrich is going to be a character worth investing in, we need to see him live with the emotional aftertaste of what he does. Not melodrama, just presence. A breath, a look, a moment where the room is too quiet. And because the premise includes him purging a shadow curse from a dying stranger, it sets a precedent that magic has intimate consequences. Purging implies there a closeness to suffering, a direct engagement with something corrupt. If the show honors that tone, then even a confrontation can feel intimate, not just explosive. There's also this really compelling tension between Aldrich's return as official business, terminating the arranged marriage contract, and the fact that he's immediately pulled into unofficial moral emergencies. That matters because it suggests he's not seeking chaos. Chaos is seeking him. It's the difference between a hero who hunts for opportunities to be admired and a hero who keeps getting cornered into choosing. And how's Alvin being arrogant tells you how they're likely to respond to being told no. Arrogant powers don't accept refusal as a valid response. They interpret it as disrespect, as an invitation to punish. So the contract termination isn't a paperwork plotline, it's a provocation. It's Aldrich announcing, "You don't own me," to a world that runs on ownership. If you connect that to Baron Dubin's mercenaries attempting to abduct women, you start seeing a very coherent thematic web. This is a story about bodily autonomy and social autonomy in a culture where powerful men feel entitled to both. Aldrich's refusal to back down is not just a heroic trait, it's an ideological rejection of that entitlement. And yes, the story could handle this clumsily. It could turn into a one good man narrative where everyone else is either helpless or evil. That would be the cheap version. The richer version is one where the town is full of people who are compromised in different ways. Some are scared. Some are resigned. Some benefit from the tyranny. Some hate it but can't afford to say so. If the show allows that spectrum to exist, then the world feels lived in and the drama feels true. Here's another rehook, because this is where the emotional stakes sneak up on you. If Aldrich becomes the person who intervenes, what happens to Tessa and Duncan? Do they become targets? Do they become leverage? Do they become the kind of friends of the hero that the world uses to control him? I'm not claiming the plot definitely goes there. I'm saying the setup invites it. And even the possibility of that is enough to make Aldrich's choices in public feel heavier. Because protecting your friends isn't just about stopping one abduction attempt. It's about what your visibility does to them. And that's why the reunion being interrupted is so harsh. It's not only that violence ruins a nice moment. It's that the world announces your connections will be tested. The story is basically refusing to let Aldrich keep his relationships in a safe little nostalgic box. The relationships exist in this dangerous society now, with all its power games and predation. Now let's talk about Baron Dubin's function as a villain, because the word tyrannical is doing a lot of work, and I want to unpack it as a drama element, not just a moral label. A tyrant in a local setting isn't just a big bad. He's daily oppression. He's the guy whose whims shape whether people eat, whether businesses survive, whether women can walk safely, whether men can speak freely without being made examples of. When that kind of character enters a tavern with mercenaries, he's not entering as a villain. He's entering as weather. He's entering as the storm everyone has learned to read and avoid. So when Aldrich refuses to back down, he's doing something that is almost socially incomprehensible to the townspeople. Not morally incomprehensible. They know it's wrong. Socially incomprehensible, because they've built survival strategies around compliance. When someone breaks that pattern, it creates chaos, and chaos is terrifying even when it's in service of justice. That's why I'd love for the show to capture the bystanders' reactions with specificity. Not just they gasp. I mean micro-reactions. Someone lowering their eyes because they don't want to be remembered as a witness. Someone inching toward the door, not because they support the Baron, but because they can't afford to be brave today. Someone in noble clothing looking embarrassed, then angry, because Aldric's refusal forces them to confront their own performative morality. Those are the moments that make a fantasy drama feel like it's about humans. And since we're tailoring this for newcomers, I want to emphasize, you don't have to be a fantasy nerd to appreciate what this setup is doing. This isn't about memorizing lore. It's about a person returning to a society that has normalized caution. The magic is the amplifier, but the core conflict is painfully familiar. What do you do when doing the right thing makes you unsafe, and everyone around you has decided safety matters more than righteousness? And that's where Aldric's training matters again. 12 years of grueling isolation can forge a person who is capable of acting without social permission. Most people need social reinforcement to be brave. Aldric might not. He might be used to being alone with his choices. That could be his advantage. It could also be his weakness if it turns him into someone who doesn't ask, doesn't listen, doesn't collaborate. There's a version of this story where Aldric's power becomes a way for him to avoid intimacy. If you can solve problems with magic, you can avoid the messy work of convincing people, of earning trust, of building coalitions. And if the show is brave, it will make that avoidance cost him emotionally. It will make him realize that power can keep you safe, but also keep you distant. That's where Tessa and Duncan, again, aren't just sentimental. They're relational friction. They can pull him back into humanity. Or, if the story is tragic in the right way, they can be the ones who show him that you can't protect everyone and that trying to will break you. And I'm going to say something else that's maybe a bit surprising. I actually like that the premise doesn't give us a clear mentor figure or counsel right away. Sometimes fantasy dramas overstuff the early episodes with exposition characters. Here, the story seems to keep it lean. Aldric, his friends, the Baron, the nobles, House Alwyn as looming political weight, the cursed stranger as a hint of a deeper threat. That's enough. It means the drama can sit in a room and breathe. Because too many shows treat fantasy like a checklist. You need a prophecy, a map, 5 kingdoms, a demon king, a chosen artifact. The mage from Avalon, from what we're given, is doing something more character-forward. It's using a few strong power dynamics to create pressure and letting the rest of the world reveal itself through conflict. Here's a small, self-aware aside. If you've ever been in a situation where someone with authority walks into a public place and suddenly everyone gets quieter, you already understand Baron Dubban. You don't need a backstory monologue. Your nervous system recognizes the vibe. And I love when writing trusts that. Now, I also want to talk about the show's potential visual identity because remote island training and tavern confrontation are very different aesthetics. And that contrast can be used to tell you who Aldric is without any dialogue. The island can be shot as harsh simplicity. Wide frames, wind, stone, the sound of waves that never stop. A place where the horizon is the only audience. That kind of environment teaches discipline because nature doesn't negotiate. If Aldric spent 12 years there, it likely taught him to endure discomfort without flinching. Then you cut to civilization, and suddenly the frames are tighter, cluttered with human objects. Streets, signage, crowds, politics. The sound is layered, footsteps, chatter, commas. And the tavern is the perfect microcosm of that. A warm interior that can become a trap the moment armed men decide it is. If the cinematography leans into that contrast, you feel Aldric's displacement. You feel him go from being alone with nature to being surrounded by people's expectations. And when violence threatens, you understand why someone trained in isolation might respond with clean, decisive force. Because the island taught him clarity. The town is teaching him complexity. And that's the kind of visual storytelling that doesn't require exposition, which is exactly what a drama like this needs. Let me rehook again, because this is where the series can either become generic or become genuinely special. Aldric's power is the easy part. The hard part is whether the show can make his choices feel ethically heavy even when the audience agrees with him. Aldric refusing to back down from mercenaries, trying to abduct women is obviously correct. But the drama comes from the method. What level of force does he choose? How does he balance protecting people with not creating more terror? Because from the perspective of the tavern patrons, a mage unleashing devastation is also terrifying, even if he's on their side. If the show acknowledges that fear, if it lets bystanders be relieved and shaken at the same time, then it's doing real emotional work. This is why I keep emphasizing sound and reaction shots. The most powerful moment in a scene like that isn't the spell. It's the silence after. It's the way someone's hands tremble when they reach for their mug again. It's the way Tessa might look at Aldric with gratitude and also a flicker of, "Who are you now?" It's Duncan's posture shifting, like he's proud, but also realizing that being close to Aldric means standing near danger. Those relationship microshifts are the glue of drama. And on the acting side, the Baron needs to feel like someone who has never been told no in public. That entitlement has a particular flavor. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's casual, almost bored. Like, "Of course you're coming with me. Why are we wasting time?" That casualness is what makes it chilling, because it means the harm is routine. Mercenaries, too, shouldn't feel like comic book henchmen if the show wants this to land. They should feel like men who have done this before. Efficient, not overly theatrical. Predatory in a way that's normalized among them. And that's how you make Aldric's refusal feel like a disruption of a system, not just a clash of personalities. Now, let's circle back to the assassination attempt, because it's an early beat that can easily get treated as action seasoning, but it's actually a huge character and theme signal. If someone tries to assassinate Aldric as he returns to civilization, it means one of two things, or both. Either his existence is a threat to someone's plans, or his power is seen as a commodity that needs to be controlled, and elimination is easier than negotiation. Either way, it reinforces the idea that Aldric doesn't have the luxury of being a private citizen. The moment he steps back into the world wants to claim or kill him. And that's why his desire for a brief moment of peace is so poignant. It's almost childish in the best way. Like, he genuinely wants to have one normal hour. But the story is saying, this world doesn't allow peace to people who won't comply. That's not just plot. That's a worldview. And it's a worldview that makes Aldric's principles necessary, but also punishing. And this is where, emotionally, I found myself connecting more than I expected to a character who, on paper, is basically a walking super weapon. Because the fantasy of being powerful is often framed as liberation, but the show's premise frames it as exposure. The more power Aldric has, the more the world reacts to him. The more he becomes a target, a symbol, a threat, an asset. Power doesn't let him hide. It drags him into visibility. There is tenderness in that, if the writing lets it be tender. The idea of someone training for 12 years, maybe thinking, when I'm done, no one can force me again. And then returning to realize people will still try, just with different methods. Contracts, titles, knives in the dark. That's a brutal realization. And if you've ever had the experience of thinking you solved something about yourself, got stronger, got smarter, got more capable, only to return to an environment that still sees you as who you used to be, that hits. The nobody dismissal from the nobles is that exact feeling, just dramatized. You did all this work, and the room still tries to shrink you. Here's another rehook line that matters. The most dangerous moment for Aldric isn't when someone attacks him, it's when someone tries to define him. House Alwyn's arrogance suggests they've already defined him as a piece in their social game. The nobles define him as a nobody, so they don't have to take him seriously. The Baron defines people as property. The shadow curse in a metaphorical sense, defines a person by what's consuming them. Aldric's entire arc could be about refusing definitions that strip agency. And the beautiful irony is that Aldrich himself could become guilty of defining others if he's not careful. If he walks into town thinking, these people are cowards, he might start treating them like children. If he thinks, I'm the only one who can fix this, he might start making decisions for everyone for their own good. That's how savior complexes happen. That's how heroes become tyrants with better PR. So the drama has to keep him humble in a way that doesn't nerf him. Not, he trips over a rock, humble. Ethical humility. The willingness to ask, what do you want? Before deciding what's best for someone. The willingness to let others have agency, even when it would be faster to take over. And that brings us back to the abduction attempt. If the women in the tavern are being targeted, and Aldrich intervenes, the way he intervenes can either restore agency or inadvertently replace one caution with another. That's subtle, but it's important. Does he protect them and then let them choose what happens next? Does he speak over them? Does he turn them into symbols? The show can do a lot with that, and it doesn't require inventing plot twists. It just requires attention to how scenes are written. Now, I also want to talk about pacing in terms of emotional tempo. The premise stacks intense beats early. Assassination attempt, curse purge, violent interruption at the tavern. If the show keeps that tempo non-stop, it risks exhausting the viewer and flattening the impact. The best dramas understand the value of contrast. After intensity, you need a moment of quiet. Not to be boring, but to let the viewer's emotions catch up. That quiet doesn't have to be long. It can be a single shot. Aldrich washing blood off his hands. Tessa's stare lingering on a doorway. Duncan swallowing words he doesn't know how to say. Silence can be a scene. And the reason I'm harping on this is because the premise clearly wants to do more than action. It wants to explore the cost of principle. You can't explore cost if you never slow down enough to feel it. Let me get slightly nerdy about structure for a second, but in a way that matters. The story's early structure appears to be built around tests. Each beat tests a different facet of Aldrich's identity. The assassination attempt tests his survivability and the world's hostility. The shadow curse tests his compassion and precision. The reunion tests his humanity and his ability to reconnect. The tavern abduction attempt tests his moral courage in public and his willingness to confront systems. That's not random. That's intentional. It means the story is building a portrait of Aldrich through pressure. And that's why the arranged marriage contract isn't just an external conflict. It's the personal baseline. It's the original violation that frames everything else. If Aldrich is returning specifically to terminate that contract, then his primary goal is autonomy. Everything else becomes a variation on that theme. The Baron violates autonomy through abduction. The nobles violate autonomy through cowardice, by allowing violations to continue. House Alvin violates autonomy through social contract and entitlement. The assassination attempt violates autonomy through direct violence. The shadow curse violates autonomy through supernatural corruption. Every beat is about the same thing. Who gets to decide what happens to your life and body? That's a strong thematic engine. It's the kind of engine that can carry a long-form drama without needing constant new gimmicks. Here's a rehook that's more of a question. If Aldrich can purge a shadow curse from a dying stranger, what does that say about the kind of threats this world is dealing with? And why someone like him being pushed into domestic politics like a marriage contract? Because that mismatch is interesting. It suggests a world where petty power games are happening in the same breath as supernatural horror. And often, in stories like this, the petty games are what allow the supernatural horror to grow. Not because evil politicians are secretly demons, necessarily, but because a society that normalizes coercion is ripe for deeper corruption. It also makes Aldrich's priorities feel human. He's not chasing the shadow curse like a quest marker. He's dealing with the immediate human problem of being controlled by a house. That makes him relatable. but it also sets up a tension. His personal war might keep pulling him away from larger threats, and the larger threats might keep pulling him away from the peace he wants. That push and pull is drama. And speaking of drama, the title, The Mage from Avalon, sets up a mythic expectation, and the show seems to enjoy subverting it by keeping things grounded and ugly. You've got a mage with immense power, yes, but he returns to find a society where women can be abducted in public and nobles will look away. That's not high fantasy escapism. That's a fantasy lens on social rot. The show's success will depend on whether it treats that rot with seriousness or uses it as set dressing for hero moments. The storyline we have suggests seriousness, because the Baron's actions are described bluntly and the noble's cowardice is emphasized. It's not romanticized. It's not treated as a quirky villain thing. It's treated as tyranny. Now, I want to talk about Tessa specifically, even though the storyline doesn't give us a list of traits, because the narrative function of childhood friend in a story about autonomy can go two ways. Either the show uses her as a motivator, someone Aldric must protect, or it uses her as a person with her own agency who challenges Aldric's worldview. The better version is obviously the latter. If the show makes Tessa simply the woman in danger, then it undercuts the very autonomy theme it's building. If, instead, Tessa is someone who has been surviving under tyranny for years, who understands the town's social realities, who has developed her own forms of courage and strategy, then her dynamic with Aldric becomes fascinating. She can appreciate his power while also warning him about consequences. She can push him to think beyond immediate confrontation. She can remind him that people here aren't simply cowards, they're entangled. Similarly, Duncan as a childhood friend can be written as either the loyal sidekick or the uneasy bridge between Aldric and the community. If Duncan stayed in this world while Aldric trained in isolation, Duncan is the one who might understand the local hierarchy, the risks, the way Dublin's power operates day to day. He might be the one who knows which nobles are complicit and which are frightened. He might be the one who can say, if you do this, here's what happens next, not to discourage Aldric, but to help him act strategically. And that's the key word, strategy. If Aldric is only reactive, the show will feel like a series of confrontations. If Aldric starts thinking strategically about how to uphold principles without creating collateral damage, then you get a character arc. You get growth that isn't about power level, but about wisdom. And I know some people hear strategy and immediately worry the show will become a chessboard of politics. I don't necessarily want it to become dry. I want it to become emotionally intelligent. I want it to acknowledge that stopping a mercenary in a tavern is one thing, stopping a system that empowers mercenaries is another. Strategy is just the bridge between those two. Now, let's zoom in on the shadow curse again, because it's the most cinematic and metaphorically rich element in the premise aside from the tavern tyranny. Mysterious shadow curse is such an evocative phrase. It implies a darkness that is not just external. Shadow clings. Shadow hides. Shadow can be inside you, not just around you. And the fact that the stranger is dying suggests urgency. Aldric's intervention is not leisurely. It's immediate. This is the kind of scene where a show can show you who Aldric is through physical performance. Is he gentle? Is he clinical? Does he hesitate before touching a stranger? Does he speak softly? Or does he focus in silence? Does the act of purging cost him, even if only emotionally? Does he look like someone who has done this before? Or like someone who is inventing the method through sheer mastery? And again, I'm not claiming specific beats. I'm saying these are the choices that define the tone. A show that wants to feel mature will likely portray the purging as unpleasant. Not pretty light swirling. Something that looks like it hurts to pull out. Something that makes you feel the violation the stranger endured. If the show does that, then it's telling you, magic is not always spectacle. Sometimes it's surgery. And that's important because it sets up the tavern confrontation as a decision between two kinds of magic. The precise, healing, purging kind that is intimate and controlled, and the devastating kind that is overwhelming and public. If Aldrich can do both, then the drama is, which does he choose and when? That's the kind of duality that makes a mage protagonist interesting. Not what's his coolest spell, but what's his relationship to force. Here's another rehook. The show is at its most gripping when it makes you wonder whether Aldrich's principles are going to save him or isolate him. Because principles are expensive. In a rotten system, they don't just cost you comfort. They cost you safety. They cost you relationships. They cost you the ability to be neutral. Once you stand up in a tavern against a baron's mercenaries, you've chosen a side whether you wanted to or not. And the nobles dismissing him as a nobody adds an extra sting because it suggests the community isn't ready to stand with him. He might end up being right alone. That's something I'm always hungry for in drama. The loneliness of being the first person to say no. It's heroic, sure, but it's also psychologically brutal. And if the show leans into that, not as martyrdom porn, but as emotional reality, it can turn a power fantasy into something more honest. Now, let's talk about the genre promise here. A lot of viewers will come for the confrontation. They want to see Aldrich flex. And the show should deliver that on some level. But the trick is to make the flex mean something. If Aldrich unleashes devastating magic, and it's just cool, it'll trend for a week and then vanish from your memory. If Aldrich unleashes devastating magic, and it changes the way the town looks at him, changes the way he looks at himself, changes the way his friends relate to him, then it becomes story. That's where editing and direction can be really brave. You can shoot a spell like a triumph, or you can shoot it like a tragedy of necessity. Same action, different meaning. If the show has the courage to let victory feel unsettling, because violence is unsettling even when justified, then it earns its drama label. And I'm going to be honest. I'm also watching for whether the show treats the women in the tavern as actual characters, not props. The premise says mercenaries attempt to forcibly abduct the women inside. That's a violent premise element. The respectful way to handle it is to center the woman's fear and agency, not the main's heroics. The show can do that through camera perspective. Who do we stay with? Whose reactions do we hold on? Do we hear the women speak? Do we see them make choices? Do we see them support each other? Do we see the town's complicity through their eyes? If the show does that, then Aldrich protecting them is not saving damsels. It's interrupting violence, which is different. It's about stopping an injustice, not claiming ownership of the victims through protection. And yes, I'm aware that's a tightrope. But the fact that the premise includes this beat means the show is already stepping onto it. I wanted to walk it with care. Now, on a more personal level, I want to talk about why this particular setup hit me in a way a lot of fantasy doesn't. It's because Aldrich's first stated goal is not grandiose. Terminating an unwanted contract is, emotionally, the kind of thing you do when you're trying to reclaim your life. It's an act of boundary setting. And boundary setting is something a lot of us only learn after we've been taken advantage of. It's not glamorous. It's awkward. It can make you look difficult. It can trigger retaliation from people who benefited from your compliance. So when a story frames a mage's return around a boundary rather than revenge or glory, it feels modern in a way I didn't expect, and it immediately gives the drama emotional relevance. And then the story escalates that boundary setting into public moral action. Aldrich refuses to back down. It's the same skill in a bigger arena. Saying no. Saying no to House Alvin. Saying no to the Baron. Saying no to a room full of people who want you to keep quiet for everyone's comfort. It's one through line. And it's powerful. Here's a rehook that's more of a promise. The more you think about it, the more the Mage from Avalon reads like a story about consent told through multiple genres at once: political drama, social horror, fantasy action. And that blend is where it can really shine if it keeps its focus. Now, I also want to touch on the title, House Alvin, and House Alvin's arrogance as shorthand for aristocratic cruelty. In stories like this, Noble houses often stand in for generational entitlement. The arrogance is not just personal attitude. It's institutional. It's the belief that tradition equals morality. So Aldric's termination of the marriage contract is a direct threat to that belief. If he can say no, then the house's power is revealed as reliant on compliance, not divine right. And once that's revealed, other people might start questioning their own chains. That's why arrogant systems respond so violently to defiance. It's not about the individual defier. It's about the precedent. And that ties right back into the assassination attempt. If Aldric is a precedent, someone will want to erase him before the idea spreads. I keep coming back to how smart it is to open with personal stakes and then immediately show the public stakes because it prevents Aldric from becoming a moral cartoon. He's not a saint descending from the heavens. He's a person with a personal problem who keeps being forced to confront a public nightmare. That's a very human kind of heroism. And in terms of relationship dynamics, there's a potential triangle here that isn't romantic, at least not from what we are told, but ideological. Aldric is the returning force of disruption. Tessa and Duncan are the grounded survivors of the status quo. They likely have different survival strategies. Tessa might be more defiant in private, more cautious in public. Duncan might be more resigned, or maybe quietly angry, or maybe someone who tried to push back and got burned. The show can make their friendships a debate about what courage looks like under tyranny. Because courage isn't one thing. There's the courage of confrontation, which Aldric has in spades. There's the courage of endurance, which the townspeople might have. There's the courage of community building, which might be the missing piece. If the show explores those different kinds of courage, it avoids making everyone except Aldric look pathetic. And to be clear, I'm not saying Aldric's confrontation isn't courageous. It is. I'm saying the richest drama will let the story respect other forms of courage too, while still condemning cowardice and complicity. It's a balance. Let's also talk about the idea of principles as a narrative device. The storyline says Aldric prepares for confrontation to protect his friends and uphold his principles. Principles are often used as a shortcut to make a hero seem noble. But principles can also be interrogated. What are Aldric's principles exactly? We can infer some: opposition to coercion, refusal to bow to tyranny, willingness to help strangers, desire for autonomy. But principles can collide. Protecting friends can conflict with protecting the broader community if his actions invite retaliation. Upholding principles can conflict with tactical restraint if the situation demands compromise. His principles might even conflict with Tessa's and Duncan's needs if they prioritize survival. If the show puts those principles under stress without making Aldric wrong in a simplistic way, it can build genuine character complexity. It can show you a hero learning that being principled is not the same as being effective, and that you sometimes need allies, patience, and strategy to make principles sustainable. And that's where Aldric's training can be used in a more interesting way than he's strong. Training also implies discipline, and discipline implies the ability to wait, the ability to endure discomfort without reacting. If Aldric is truly disciplined, then his confrontation with Dubban won't just be rage. It'll be measured. And measured force is terrifying in its own way. There's a big difference between a mage who lashes out and a mage who chooses his escalation with calm eyes. The second one makes you believe he could end you, and he's choosing not to. That's drama. Here's another rehook line, because this is the pivot point I'm most interested in. The story is setting up a world where the law is a costume. So what does justice even look like? If nobles cower and tyrants act openly, then formal justice mechanisms are either broken or captured. In that context, Aldric stepping in becomes extralegal justice. That's dangerous territory, narratively and morally. Because extralegal justice can become vigilantism, and vigilantism can become tyranny. So the show has to make Aldric's relationship to justice nuanced. It has to make him aware of the danger of becoming judge, jury, executioner, even if he never literally executes anyone, even if he's merciful. The act of imposing force outside systems is still a huge moral claim. One of the best ways to handle this is to show Aldrich feeling the weight of being the only person in the room capable of enforcing anything. Not with melodrama, but with a kind of quiet dread. The dread of knowing you can fix the immediate problem, but you might be making yourself the center of the world's moral machinery. And that's not sustainable. This is where my earlier contrarian take about the nobles becomes important again. If the nobles are simply portrayed as pathetic, then Aldrich's vigilantism feels unquestionably righteous. If the nobles are portrayed as trapped, compromised, afraid, then Aldrich's intervention becomes a catalyst that forces the community to confront its own choices. That's a deeper story. And yes, it's a little uncomfortable to empathize with people who looked away while women were being abducted. But drama isn't about comfort. Drama is about looking at how humans become capable of terrible normalization. Now, since this is a long-form review, I want to spend a moment on how the show's music can support the tone. Fantasy scores often go epic by default, and epic can be numb. The better approach for a story like this is to let the score be tense and intimate. Let the tavern have a warmth that gets stripped away. Let the Baron's presence be marked by motive that feels like pressure, not like a villain anthem. Let Aldrich's power be underscored, not with triumphant brass, but with something almost too quiet, like the world is holding its breath. Silence can also be musical. When a tyrant walks in, sometimes you cut the score. You let boots on wood be the music. You let people's breath be the rhythm. That kind of sound design makes a confrontation feel real. And with the shadow curse, the sound can be otherworldly in a way that feels invasive. A faint, whispering texture. A wet, unnatural pull. Something that makes you feel like the curse is alive. Not just dark smoke. Again, all of this is craft talk. But it matters because it's the difference between cool fantasy and immersive drama. Now, I want to address something that some viewers might push back on. The idea of an overpowered hero stepping in to stop an abduction attempt can feel like an easy moral win. Like, of course you stop it. Where's the drama? The drama is in the aftermath. And it's in the interpersonal fallout. If Aldrich saves the day, does the town thank him or resent him? Do the nobles try to co-opt him or punish him? Do Tessa and Duncan feel safe around him or worried for him? Does Aldrich feel relief or anger or both? Does he feel like he's slipping into a role he never wanted? That's why the show has to be good at reaction and consequence, not just conflict. And it's also why the arranged marriage contract is such a smart continuing thread. Because even if Aldrich handles the immediate tavern crisis, he still has to face House Alvin. The contract termination is a social and political confrontation that can't be solved by blasting mercenaries without turning Aldrich into exactly what his enemies might want to paint him as: a dangerous rogue mage. House Alvin's arrogance suggests they'll use law, reputation, and tradition as weapons. Aldrich's response to that will reveal whether he can fight with more than force. And that's where the officially terminate phrasing is important. He's not just tearing up a paper in private. He's doing it officially, meaning he's engaging with the system on some level. He's trying to reclaim autonomy through formal channels, not just through violence. That's a crucial character note. It suggests he wants legitimacy. He wants to do this the right way, if the world will let him. But the assassination attempt suggests the world might not let him. Here's a rehook that should keep you with me. If Aldrich is trying to do things officially and the world keeps responding with violence and coercion, how long before he stops believing in official solutions? That's an arc question. And it's the kind of arc question that can make a show bingeable, because you're not just watching what happens. You're watching someone's philosophy evolve under pressure. Now, let's talk about Aldrich's homecoming quickly draws danger. Homecoming is a loaded word. It implies belonging. It implies nostalgia. It implies the idea of returning to something that is yours. But when homecoming draws danger, It means the home is no longer safe. Or perhaps it never was, and Aldrich just didn't see it as a child. That's another layer the show can explore through Tessa and Duncan. Maybe they've lived with Dubban's tyranny long enough that their definition of home has become complicated. Home is where your people are, but it's also where your people suffer. Aldrich returning with fresh eyes shaped by isolation and training, might see the injustice more clearly. Why they see it as background radiation. That tension can create friction in their relationships. Not because they don't care, but because they've had to adapt. Aldrich might interpret adaptation as acceptance. They might interpret his confrontation as reckless. Both could be partially right. And that's good drama. It's the kind of conflict where everyone's motives are understandable, and the viewer has to sit in the discomfort of complexity. I also want to point out that the premise has a really strong tone braid. It braids together three tonal threads: political pressure, house Alvin contract, physical threat, assassination attempt, mercenaries, and supernatural dread, shadow curse. That braid is what makes the world feel bigger than one conflict. It suggests multiple arenas of danger. A lot of fantasy dramas pick one lane. They either go political, or go monster of the week, or go mystical quest. The Mage from Avalon seems to be setting up a story where all three lanes exist and influence each other. That's ambitious. It can be messy if not handled carefully, but if handled well, it creates that feeling of a world that doesn't revolve around one plotline. Because the truth is, societies can be dealing with multiple forms of rot at once. Political arrogance, local tyranny, and supernatural corruption don't politely take turns. Now, since we're being moderate with spoilers and only using what's confirmed, I'm going to stay away from claiming what happens in the confrontation. But I can talk about what the story positions as the emotional purpose of that confrontation. The purpose is not just protect the women. It's Aldrich publicly declares what he will not tolerate. That declaration matters because it sets a boundary, not just for himself, but for the community's expectations. It tells people, there is now at least one person who will resist. That changes the moral landscape. And that's why the nobles' reaction will likely be complex. Some will hate him because resistance threatens their comfort. Some will fear him because power is scary. Some might secretly be relieved because someone finally did what they couldn't. Some might want to use him. The show can get a lot of mileage out of that range of reactions without needing to invent new villains every week. Let me give you another little sensory, cinematic moment. Not a new plot event, just the emotional texture I hope the show leans into. Imagine the tavern right before Aldrich acts. The mercenaries are too close. The Baron's confidence is suffocating. Tessa's body language tightens, maybe not even in a dramatic way, just in that involuntary way where your shoulders rise like you're trying to protect your throat. Duncan's jaw clenches because there's nothing he can do. The nobles stare at their cups like the wood grain holds the answer. And Aldrich is still, not calm like a statue, still like someone who's choosing. You hear the smallest sounds, a chair leg scraping, a swallow, the pop of a fire. The camera lingers for one extra beat on Aldrich's eyes. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, determination with grief in it. And then whatever magic happens, happens. That's what I mean when I say the decision is the special effect. Now, there's also something I want to praise about the premise's moral clarity. It doesn't muddy the waters on the abduction attempt. It calls it what it is. It frames Dubban as tyrannical. It frames the nobles as cowardly. It frames Aldrich's resistance as principled. Some people might call that simplistic, but I don't. I think moral clarity is sometimes necessary, especially when depicting coercive violence. Not everything needs to be morally grey to be mature. The maturity can come from consequences, psychology, and systems, not from pretending abduction is a nuanced debate topic. So I respect the premise for being blunt there. Where I want the nuance is in the community's entanglement and in Aldrich's internal evolution, not in whether the Baron is misunderstood. No, thank you. And since we are on the subject of moral grey, I drop another surprising take. An overpowered protagonist can actually make a story more morally complex, not less, if the show is willing to ask hard questions about force. Because when the protagonist is weak, the moral question is usually, how do you survive? When the protagonist is strong, the moral question becomes, how do you choose to use strength? That's a richer ethical field. Aldric's immense power forces him to confront the ethics of intervention. It forces him to consider proportionality. It forces him to consider fear. It forces him to consider what kind of precedent he sets. Those are adult questions. And I think that's why the show's setup is so compelling. It's not asking, can Aldric win? It's asking, what will winning turn him into? And what will winning demand of everyone else? Here's another rehook. If Aldric becomes the symbol of resistance, is that fair to him? Because that's the other cost of heroism. People project their hopes onto you. They ask you to carry their fear. They ask you to be unbreakable. And Aldric has already spent 12 years isolated. He's not coming into this with a strong support network. Tessa and Duncan are there, yes, but they're also living in the same dangerous environment. They can't become his therapists and his army at the same time. So the show can explore the emotional exhaustion of being everyone's answer. It can show Aldric yearning for peace and being denied it not only by villains, but by people's expectations. Now, in terms of dialogue writing, I hope the show avoids the trap of making Aldric speak in constant maxims. Principle-driven characters can become unbearable if they're always delivering speeches. The best version of Aldric is someone whose principles show through choices, not monologues. And the best version of the Baron is someone who doesn't need to explain his tyranny. He enacts it. He expects it. His arrogance is his dialogue. If the show gets that right, the tavern scene can be electric without being wordy. A few lines can carry everything if the performances are sharp. And that brings us to casting chemistry again. Tessa and Duncan need to feel like real people with history, not just plot devices. They should have their own reactions to Aldric's return. Maybe they're happy, but there's resentment, you got to leave. Maybe there's relief, someone strong is back. Maybe there's suspicion, who are you now? All of those emotions can exist at once. That's the kind of layered relationship writing that makes a show rewatchable. And it also gives the show room for humor that feels human, not forced. Like, even in dark times, friends will have awkward moments. Someone makes a dumb joke because they don't know how to handle emotion. Someone calls Aldric out on how weird he's gotten. Someone tries to pretend the world isn't on fire for one sip of ale. Those small moments can make the later violence hit harder by contrast. I'm not asking for sitcom energy. I'm asking for the kind of humor that is actually a coping mechanism. The kind of humor that makes you feel the humanity the story is trying to protect. Now, since the storyline includes local nobles, I want to touch on class dynamics because they're clearly present. Nobles covering while tyranny happens suggests that nobility here is more about status than courage. It suggests a decayed aristocracy. They may have titles, but no spine. Or they may be deeply complicit, and their fear is performative. Both interpretations are interesting. If they're genuinely afraid, it shows how the Baron has outstripped even formal power structures. If they're complicit, it shows how tyranny is supported by elite cowardice and self-interest. Either way, the nobles dismissing Aldric as a nobody suggests they still cling to status as a way to organize reality even when it fails. That dismissal is also a threat. It's a way of saying, you have no standing here. And Aldric's existence challenges that. He's power without title, at least in that moment. He's the thing aristocracies fear, competence that doesn't come with their permission. That's why the arranged marriage contract is such a perfect aristocratic weapon. It's how they try to convert competence into controlled lineage. They're trying to make Aldric's power part of their bloodline strategy. That's aristocracy 101. So Aldric terminating the contract is not just personal. It's anti-aristocratic. It's anti-feudal. And that's a big deal. Here's another rehook. If Aldric refuses aristocratic control and refuses local tyranny, where does that leave him politically? Outside everything. And being outside everything is dangerous. Because if you're outside the system can label you anything it wants. Rogue mage, threat to order, upstart, instigator. And the nobles who dismissed him as a nobody can flip into calling him a monster once he acts. That's a very real dynamic. People dismiss you until they can't, then they demonize you so they don't have to admit they were wrong. That's the kind of social hypocrisy that can make a drama feel painfully sharp. I also want to talk about the remote island training again, but from a different angle. Isolation can create myth. People will imagine what happened there. They'll fill the absence with stories. He learned forbidden magic. He made a deal. He's not human anymore. That myth-making can become a weapon used against him. And that's where the shadow curse becomes a particularly dangerous plot element, because shadow magic often triggers fear and superstition in fantasy worlds. If Aldric is seen using magic that deals with shadow, purging it, controlling it, understanding it, people might not differentiate between healing and wielding. They might just hear shadow and assume corruption. So Aldric's act of saving a dying stranger could ironically become another reason the community fears him. That's tragic. It's also great drama. And again, I'm not asserting the show definitely does this. I'm saying the ingredients are there for that kind of misunderstanding, which would align perfectly with the theme of being defined by others. Now, to keep this grounded for newcomers, you don't have to get lost in speculation to enjoy what's already present. The show's premise is already giving you multiple emotional entry points. If you care about political autonomy, the marriage contract is your hook. If you care about moral courage, the tavern tyranny is your hook. If you care about supernatural mystery, the shadow curse is your hook. If you care about friendship dynamics, the reunion with Tessa and Duncan is your hook. That's a well-designed premise. It's broad but coherent. Now, one thing that sometimes gets overlooked in reviews is the physicality of acting in magic shows. If Aldric is a mage, his body language when he channels power matters. Does he look like it's effortless? Does it look like it's disciplined? Does it look like it's heavy? The unparalleled power can be conveyed through stillness more effectively than through flailing. I always think about how the best powerful performances don't rush. They don't need to. The character knows they can end the situation. So they move like someone with time. That can be chilling, and it can make the audience feel like they're watching someone who is dangerous even when quiet. And for the Baron, physicality matters too. Tyrants often take up space. They stand too close. They touch without asking. They speak like they own the air. If the actor playing Dubber nails that invasive presence, the audience will feel the violation before anything explicit happens. That's how you create dread. Here's a rehook that's less about plot and more about craft. The show's tone will live or die on whether it makes you feel the tension before the magic starts. Because anyone can animate a spell. Not everyone can build dread. Dread is pacing, gaze, sound, silence, and the sense that something irreversible is about to happen. Now, I want to zoom out and talk about why terminating an arranged marriage contract is such a sharp inciting goal in a fantasy drama. In a lot of fantasy, marriage contracts are treated like romantic obstacles. Oh no, the prince has to marry the princess he doesn't love. It becomes a love triangle engine. Here, the contract is framed as unwanted and tied to an arrogant house. That framing makes it less romance and more caution. It makes it about bodily autonomy and political ownership. That's a heavier, more adult use of the trope. It also immediately makes Aldric's no feel like a radical act. In systems that rely on arranged marriages for alliances, refusing a contract is refusing the logic of the system. And it also suggests Aldric isn't easily seduced by status. If House Alwyn is arrogant, they probably assume their offer is irresistible. Aldric rejecting it is humiliating for them. And humiliation is a dangerous trigger for arrogant people. So the show is setting Aldrich up to be punished for refusing to be owned. That is a compelling and sadly universal dynamic. Different costumes, same human behavior. Now, I'm going to get emotionally honest again for a second. Watching a story like this, with women being targeted in public and people in power looking away, hits a nerve. Not because it's shocking in a cheap way, but because it's the kind of thing that happens in different forms in real life all the time. People rationalize. People freeze. People avoid. People tell themselves it's not their business. And the victims are left to carry the reality alone. So when Aldrich refuses to back down, there's a catharsis to it. It's not just cool Mage. It's the catharsis of someone doing what you wish more people would do. Intervene. But the show can't let that catharsis become complacency. It can't let the audience feel like the problem is solved because one powerful man showed up. The best version of this drama will let the catharsis coexist with discomfort. It will make you think, why did it take someone like Aldrich? Why weren't the nobles enough? Why is the system designed this way? That's when a show sticks with you. Here's another rehook. The more satisfying Aldrich's intervention feels, the more the show should make you question the world that made such intervention necessary. Now, to keep building out the craft discussion, let's consider how the show might handle color and lighting. The island training could be cold, desaturated, elemental. Civilization could be warmer but dirtier. The tavern could start with umber warmth and then shift into harsher contrast as danger arrives, like the firelight becomes sinister when shadows dip in. And if the shadow curse is visualized, the show can use that palette as a thematic echo. Shadow corruption could visually resemble the moral corruption in the town. Creeping, invasive, darkening corners. If the visuals align those elements, you get coherence. You get a sense that the world's supernatural and social darkness are connected. Again, you don't need to invent plot to appreciate thematic visual coherence. It's about mood. Now, a quick note on the name Stubborn, because it has that gritty, almost harsh phonetic quality. Names matter in fantasy. A baron named something smooth can feel like court intrigue. A baron with a harsher name can feel like blunt force. It's a small thing, but it supports the sense that this is local tyranny, not elegant villainy. And Aldrich, as a name, has that classic heroic weight without being overly fancy. It grounds him. He doesn't sound like a prophecy. He sounds like a person. Okay, so where does this leave us emotionally at this point in the story? We have Aldrich returning with one personal mission, immediately facing lethal hostility, choosing compassion with the cursed stranger, trying to reconnect with his friends, and then being forced into a public stand against tyranny. That sequence positions Aldrich as a person who keeps trying to choose peace and keeps being denied it. And that denial is going to shape him. What I'm most interested in, moving forward, is whether the show allows Aldrich to be affected. Not in a he becomes edgy way. In a human way. Does he become more protective? More suspicious? More strategic? Does he harden? Does he learn to trust? Does he learn to delegate? Does he learn that power without community is a trap? Because that's the ultimate drama question for an overpowered protagonist. Can you remain human when the world forces you to be a symbol? And the reason I'm lingering on that is because the story has already established that people are ready to dismiss him, attack him, and likely attempt to control him. That's a recipe for isolation. If Aldrich responds by withdrawing emotionally, the show could become bleak. If he responds by building bonds, it becomes hopeful. If he responds by dominating, it becomes cautionary. Any of those can be compelling if written well, but the show needs to choose consciously. Here's another rehook before I land this stretch. The show is basically daring Aldrich to become the thing he hates, and the tension is whether he can win without surrendering his principles to the very logic of coercion he's fighting. And right now, at this point in the flow, the tavern confrontation is that first public crucible. It's the moment where Aldrich's private morality becomes a public act. And once that happens, the story's world can't unsee him. The only question is what it decides to do with him next. What it decides to do with him next is where the drama can either get lazy or get genuinely piercing, because once a town has seen someone refuse a tyrant in public, the collective imagination changes. People who have been living with fear for years suddenly have to process a new possibility, that the Baron isn't untouchable. And if the Baron isn't untouchable, then everything else that's been just the way it is becomes questionable too, including a noble house's right to treat a marriage contract like a chain. And the reason that matters is because Aldric's whole vibe, at least in this setup, is not conquest. It's boundary. It's the quiet, stubborn insistence that there are lines you don't cross. The trouble is, a world like this doesn't politely respect lines. A world like this tests them like a bored kid pawing at a bruise. So even without inventing specifics, you can already feel the story positioning the next stretch as a kind of aftershock drama. Not what explosion happens next, but how does everyone metabolize what just happened? Who tightens control? Who panics? Who tries to spin a story? Who tries to pretend it never happened? And who, quietly, starts hoping? Because hope is dangerous in a tyrannical town. Hope gets people killed. That's the ugly part nobody wants to say out loud, and it's the part a mature drama will acknowledge. It will show you that Aldric's courage is inspiring and also destabilizing. It's a candle in a room full of gas fumes. That's the kind of layered conflict that sustains a long-form drama. Now, I want to touch on performance nuance again, because a story like this can live or die on how Aldric's emotions are communicated. A character who is powerful and principled can become emotionally flat if the actor plays only stoicism. Stoicism can be compelling, but only if it has cracks. Only if you can see the effort it takes. Only if you can see the person underneath choosing stoicism as a tool, not being stoic because the script forgot to write feelings. So I'd be looking for microsignals. The moment Aldric's jaw tightens before he speaks. The moment his gaze flickers toward Tessa and Duncan when mercenaries enter, like he's recalculating his priorities. The moment his shoulders drop after purging the curse, like he just carried something heavier than he expected. Those microsignals are what make a character feel alive. And for Tessa and Duncan, the best performances would include that subtle mix of affection and distance that comes from time apart. The warmth is there, but it has edges. The reunion isn't a reset. It's a meeting of changed people. That's where the writing can avoid sentimentality. It can let the friends be glad and awkward at once. It can let them misread each other. It can let them step on old wounds without meaning to. That's real friendship. Here's a rehook that's simple. The show isn't really asking whether Aldric can win, it's asking whether Aldric can belong. Belonging is harder than winning. Belonging requires compromise and trust and vulnerability. Winning requires force and clarity. Aldric is trained for winning. Is he trained for belonging? And if he can't belong, then the story becomes about a man who protects a world he can't live in. That's tragic. That's also compelling if done with honesty. Now, I want to address the tonal risk of unparalleled power again, because viewers often have a knee-jerk reaction. If he's unparalleled, then nothing matters. That's not true if the show is smart. It just means the show has to shift what matters. What matters can be reputation, legitimacy, relationships, moral integrity, the safety of others, the stability of a town, the ability to sleep at night after making a choice. Aldric can be physically safe and still be emotionally endangered. He can be able to win and still lose something vital. That's drama. And it's also where the music and cinematography can do subtle work. A triumphant visual language says he's a hero. A more restrained, haunting visual language says he's a force. Those are different. If the show wants to feel mature, it will likely lean into Aldric being a force that is trying to be a person. Now, since we are in the final part of the project structure, but not anywhere near the end of what this conversation needs to cover, I want to spend time on the idea of principles as something that can be used against you. Aldric's enemies can predict him if he is consistent. If he always helps the dying stranger, they can plant dying strangers. If he always protects women from abduction, they can stage abductions as distractions. If he always insists on doing things officially, they can bury him in official procedures. Again, I'm not claiming specific future plots. I'm highlighting a dramatic truth. Principles are both armor and vulnerability. They make you reliable, and reliability makes you predictable. So Aldrich will have to learn flexibility without betrayal of self. That's one of the hardest character arcs to write. How do you evolve without losing your moral identity? The shadow curse is interesting here too, because shadow implies deception and hiddenness. If Aldrich is fighting shadow corruption, he might be forced to operate in shadows himself. He might be forced to learn stealth, secrecy, manipulation, tools that can stain a principled person. And that's where the show can do something really compelling. It can show that fighting corruption risks corrupting you, not because you become evil, but because you adopt the methods of your enemies. That's a heavy theme. It fits the premise. It also fits the idea of someone returning from isolation into a morally compromised society. Here's another rehook. The show is setting up a world where doing the right thing loudly gets you attacked. So what happens when Aldrich realizes he might need to do the right thing quietly? That pivot is where a lot of dramas get interesting. Not because quiet righteousness is better, but because it forces the hero into unfamiliar territory. A public stand is straightforward. Quiet strategy is messy. Now, one of the things I'd be watching for is how the show portrays the town itself. Is it just a backdrop for Aldrich's hero moments? Or is it a character? A character town has moods. It has rumors. It has shifting alliances. It has people who surprise you. The premise's inclusion of local nobles suggests the town has a social hierarchy worth exploring. And the tavern is already a community hub. That's where rumors spread. That's where loyalties are tested. That's where a tyrant makes an example. A tavern isn't just a set, it's a social organ. If the show understands that, it can keep returning to communal spaces as arenas for moral conflict, not just as places to drink. And it can show how tyranny operates through spectacle. A baron abducting women in public is a spectacle designed to remind everyone, I can do this, and you can't stop me. Aldrich stopping it becomes a counter-spectacle. And counter-spectacles are dangerous because they invite escalation. So the town's reaction to spectacle becomes crucial. Do they cheer? Do they hide? Do they whisper? Do they report to the Baron? Do they report to House Alvin? Do they cling to denial? All of those reactions can coexist in different people. That's how you build a believable community. Now, I want to talk about the relationship between Aldrich's official act of terminating the marriage contract and his unofficial act of confronting tyranny, because those two acts can change how people interpret each other. If Aldrich is seen as a disruptive force in public, House Alvin can frame his contract termination as part of a pattern of instability. He's reckless. He's dangerous. He doesn't respect tradition. That framing can be used to justify coercive responses. Conversely, if Aldrich is seen as someone who protected people in the tavern, his refusal of the marriage contract can be seen by some as principled. He doesn't bow. He's not for sale. He's not owned. That can inspire support. So the order in which the world sees Aldrich matters. The narrative around him matters. And in a drama, narrative control is power. That's why the assassination attempt is so significant. It implies someone wants to control the narrative by eliminating the subject. Dead men don't complicate stories. Dead men don't inspire. Now, one more craft angle. How does the show visually distinguish Aldrich's magic from the shadow curse? If both are arcane, there's a risk they blur. But if Aldrich's magic is portrayed as clear, structured, luminous, while the shadow curse is portrayed as chaotic, invasive, whispering, then you create a visual moral language. You tell the viewer, without words, what kind of force each is. And if the show wants to be even more interesting, it can complicate that. It can hint that purging shadow requires touching shadow, that light and dark are not clean categories. that could depend the story's ethical ambiguity without muddying its moral clarity on coercion and tyranny. Because again, you don't need to make the abduction attempt morally gray. You can keep that morally clear and still explore ambiguity in the supernatural layer. Here's another rehook. The show has already shown us 3 kinds of coercion: legal, physical, and supernatural. And the question is which one Aldrich is least prepared to fight. Aldrich is likely prepared to fight physical coercion. That's what training suggests. He's prepared for violence. He's prepared for survival. He's prepared for confrontation. Legal coercion is trickier. He can break a contract with force, but that makes him a criminal in the eyes of the system. If he wants to do it officially, he has to outmaneuver arrogance. He has to navigate institutions that may already be compromised. Supernatural coercion, the shadow curse, is perhaps the most insidious because it attacks the self from within. Aldrich can purge it, but can he prevent it? Can he understand its source? Can he protect an entire community if it spreads? That's the kind of threat where even an immense reservoir might not be enough if the threat is subtle. And that's how you keep stakes alive. You don't need to make Aldrich weaker. You make the problems more complex than raw force. Now, I want to sit with the emotional impact of Aldrich helping the stranger because it connects to the show's portrayal of principle in a way that could become its signature. Helping a stranger is a choice that has no guaranteed reward. It's pure. It's also costly. And in a world where Aldrich is already being targeted, choosing to help a stranger is choosing exposure. It's choosing to be seen. It's choosing to leave traces. In a paranoid political environment, leaving traces is dangerous. So Aldrich's compassion is not only moral, it's risky. And that's what makes it meaningful. Compassion that costs nothing is easy. Compassion that costs something is character. And I think that's why, personally, I find myself rooting for Aldrich, not because he's strong, but because he seems unwilling to let strength become an excuse for detachment. He's willing to get involved. But involvement is a trap, too, because you can get involved with every injustice until you break. So the show's long-term emotional arc, if it's smart, will include burnout. Not in a melodramatic sense. In the quiet sense of how many times can you be the one who intervenes before you start to resend the people you're saving? That's an ugly question, but it's real. And it's especially real for someone with immense power, because people will keep bringing you their problems. And if you say no, you feel guilty. And if you say yes, you get exhausted. And if you get exhausted, you get sloppy. And if you get sloppy, someone gets hurt. It's a spiral. Here's another rehook. Aldrich's power might make him capable of saving people, but it also makes him the kind of person the world will never stop asking. Now, let's talk about what makes a devastating magical confrontation emotionally satisfying without being morally empty. The best confrontations have a moral geometry. The hero's action reveals what they value most. In the tavern, Aldrich values protecting his friends and upholding his principles. That means he values people and autonomy. So his magic, ideally, would reflect that. It would be targeted at the aggressors. It would be protective rather than punitive for its own sake. It would prioritize preventing harm, not demonstrating dominance. If the show does that, it avoids glamorizing cruelty. It lets Aldrich be strong without being sadistic. And the show's direction can reinforce that by how it frames the victims. Keep them in frame. Don't let them disappear as the camera worships the hero. Let the audience remember what's at stake. That's the difference between an action scene and a drama scene with action. Now, I want to talk about Duncan again, because male friendship in fantasy dramas can be either incredibly shallow or surprisingly tender, and a story like this has the opportunity to do something honest with it. Aldrich and Duncan were childhood friends. That means Duncan knew Aldrich before the myth. Duncan knew Aldrich before unparalleled power. That gives Duncan a unique role. He can treat Aldrich like a person when everyone else treats him like a force. But that also puts pressure on Duncan. Because if Aldric becomes dangerous, Duncan will notice first. And if Aldric becomes isolated, Duncan might be one of the few who can reach him. That's a heavy emotional role, and it can produce great scenes. The friend who wants to be proud but is afraid, the friend who wants to support but doesn't want to become collateral. And with Tessa, the dynamic can be even more emotionally loaded because of the gendered violence present in the premise. Tessa has likely had to navigate a world where men like Dubban feel entitled. Her relationship with Aldric can explore what it means to trust a powerful man, even a good one, even a principled one. That's a subtle tension a lot of fantasy avoids because it's uncomfortable. But this premise is already in uncomfortable territory. It can either handle it with maturity or gloss over it. I hope it handles it with maturity. Because if Tessa is written with agency, she can be someone who appreciates Aldric's protection while still insisting on her own choices. She can push back against the idea that being protected means being controlled. She can demand respect, not just rescue. That would align perfectly with the show's autonomy theme. Here's another rehook. The show has all the ingredients for a story where protection is interrogated as much as power, and that's when it becomes more than fantasy comfort food. Now, to bring in the idea of atmosphere again, I want to talk about how the show might treat the city or town beyond the tavern. A tyrannical baron implies a landscape shaped by fear that can be shown in small details. People moving quickly, avoiding eye contact with guards, shops closing early, whispers stopping when certain symbols appear. If the show invests in those details, then Aldric's return feels like walking into a place where joy has been rationed. That makes his desire for peace feel almost heartbreaking. Like, what does peace even mean here? A drink without being noticed? A conversation without looking over your shoulder? A night where no one gets taken? That's not peace. That's survival. And when Aldric realizes that, it can ignite something in him that is more than anger. It can ignite grief. Grief for what his home became. Grief for what his friends endured. That grief can be a powerful motivator, but it can also be dangerous because grief can become rage, and rage can become cruelty. So again, the drama is not whether Aldric fights. It's how he manages what he feels when he fights. Now, I want to talk about the show's potential use of symbolism because Avalon is heavy symbolism. Avalon is often associated with refuge, otherworldliness, transformation. It's a place apart. Aldric coming from Avalon into this corrupt civilization can be read as the intrusion of myth into mundane cruelty. It can be read as the return of a lost ideal. But the show's premise doesn't treat Aldric like a shining saint. It treats him like a man with boundaries. That's a more grounded kind of idealism. And if the show is clever, it can play with the idea that Avalon itself might not have been peaceful. It might have been grueling and isolated. So Avalon becomes not a paradise, but a crucible. Aldric doesn't return with innocence. He returns with scars. That makes from Avalon less like from heaven and more like from a forge. And that's a cool tonal shift. Here's a rehook. The show's title promises myth, but the premise delivers bureaucracy, predation, and public cowardice. And that contrast is exactly why it feels fresh. Because it's easy to make fantasy pretty. It's harder to make fantasy honest. Now, one thing I want to critique, or at least flag as a risk, based on the premise alone, is the density of early inciting incidents. Assassination attempt, curse purge, reunion, tavern tyranny, looming marriage contract conflict. That's a lot of narrative ignition. If the show handles it with emotional breadth, it's exciting. If it rushes, it can feel like it's trying too hard to prove it has stakes. The key will be whether the writing trusts its own conflicts enough to sit in them. For example, the assassination attempt should not just be, and then he survived. It should shape Aldric's behavior. It should make him cautious or alert. It should make him aware that he's being hunted. That awareness should color how he walks into the tavern, how he stands near doors, how he scans faces. Small behavioral choices can make that plot beat feel real rather than disposable. Similarly, the curse purge shouldn't just prove he's skilled. It should shape his emotional state. It should remind him that the world has suffering beyond his personal contract problem. It should tug him toward broader responsibility, even if he doesn't want it. And the tavern confrontation shouldn't just be a set piece. It should reframe his relationship with his home. It should make him realize that terminating a contract is only one battle in a larger war over autonomy. If the show lets each beat leave a mark, then the density becomes richness. If it doesn't, it becomes clutter. Here's another rehook question. Does the show want Aldric to be a character who reacts to a world, or a character who reshapes a world? Those are different trajectories. A reactive hero is constantly being pulled into crisis. A reshaping hero chooses targets, builds alliances, changes institutions. Both can be compelling. The premise suggests Aldric is being pulled at first. The question is whether he transitions into reshaping. And that transition is where character arcs happen. It's where immense power becomes story power. Now, I want to circle back to the nobles, because I don't want to let them off the hook too gently. Yes, cowardice is learned under tyranny. Yes, fear can be conditioned. But also, nobles have resources. They have status. They have options the common people don't. So their covering hits differently than a bartender's covering. The noble's failure is not only fear, it's abdication. They have social responsibility that they're refusing. And the show calling that out, by emphasizing their covering and their dismissal of Aldric, suggests it wants to critique elite complicity. That's a theme I'm always hungry for in fantasy, because fantasy loves to romanticize nobility. It loves to pretend titles come with honor. But real power structures often come with selfishness. So, if the mage from Avalon is willing to make nobles look small, that's already a point in its favor. At the same time, the show can create nuance by making not all nobles the same. Some could be cowards. Some could be collaborators. Some could be quietly resistant but trapped by politics. That variety can prevent the critique from becoming cartoonish. And it can also create interesting allies and enemies for Aldric. Not all opposition has to be violent. Some opposition can be social. Some can be rhetorical. Some can be bureaucratic. Which brings us back again to the official termination of the marriage contract. That's bureaucracy as battlefield. It's not glamorous, but it can be tense if the show frames it as a fight over legitimacy. Because legitimacy is power. If House Alwyn can paint Aldric as illegitimate, they can isolate him. If Aldric can claim legitimacy without being owned, he can become dangerous in a different way. He can become a credible alternative to the existing power structures. Here's a rehook. The real Mage threat to aristocracy isn't that Aldric can destroy them, it's that Aldric can make people stop believing in them. Belief is the foundation. Titles are paper without belief. Tyrants are mortal without belief. Contracts are ink without belief. So in that sense, Aldric's stand in the tavern is a threat to belief. It tells people, you don't have to accept this. And that idea is infectious. Now, I want to talk about why the show's moderate spoiler-friendly setup still gives us enough to evaluate its storytelling instincts. We're not looking at a full arc. We're looking at the way it chooses its first conflicts. And those choices reveal values. The show chooses to open around autonomy rather than destiny. It chooses to include a compassionate act, curse purge, rather than only destructive acts. It chooses to depict tyranny as public and normalized rather than secret and exotic. It chooses to show elites as cowardly and dismissive rather than heroic. Those are values. Those are narrative commitments. And if it continues to honor them, it will likely remain more socially sharp than the average fantasy drama. That said, it also risks becoming heavy. The show will need moments of relief and beauty, not to trivialize the darkness, but to remind us what Aldric is fighting for. Friendship, warmth, laughter, ordinary peace. The tavern, before it becomes a battleground, is exactly that. It's a place where people try to feel normal. So the show should protect the humanity of those spaces. It should let the tavern have warmth at times, even after violence. It should let relationships have softness even under threat. Otherwise, the story becomes a grind. And I'll be honest. As a viewer, I can handle darkness. What I can't handle is darkness without meaning. If the show uses violence to say something about caution and power, and then it shows the cost and the resistance, that's meaningful. If it uses violence only to make Aldrich look cool, that's empty. So far, the premise suggests meaning. I'm hoping the execution follows through. Here's another rehook. The show's most important special effect might end up being the feeling you get when someone finally says, "No, not here, not tonight, not ever again." That's the emotional fantasy. The magic is just the delivery system. Now, I want to talk about Aldrich's immense magical reservoir one more time in a way that ties to theme. Reservoirs are stored potential. Their pressure held in containment. They're not meant to be spilled carelessly. If the show wants to be elegant, it can treat Aldrich's reservoir as a metaphor for repressed emotion. 12 years of isolation, training, discipline, perhaps suppression. Returning to a corrupt world that triggers anger, grief, protectiveness, disgust. Aldrich is holding in a reservoir of feeling as much as a reservoir of magic. So the devastating confrontation becomes not just magical release, but emotional release. And that's where it can be cathartic and scary at the same time. And if the show is really brave, it will make Aldrich afraid of his own reservoir. Not because he thinks he'll turn evil, but because he knows what uncontrolled release can do. He knows devastation doesn't only hit villains. It hits rooms. It hits bystanders. It hits the world. That self-awareness would make him feel mature. It would also create tension. The more he holds back, the more people get hurt. The more he releases, the more he risks becoming a new terror. That's a compelling bind. Now, as we keep going, there's one more angle I want to explore. The way the story positions Aldrich as someone returning to end a marriage contract suggests he's trying to choose his own life. But the world keeps forcing him into other people's crises. That creates a subtle moral question. Does Aldrich get to prioritize himself? Because heroes are often written as if self-sacrifice is automatically noble and automatically expected. But in a story about autonomy, forcing the protagonist to sacrifice his own life plans for everyone else's needs can become another form of coercion, even if it's for a good cause. I'm not saying Aldrich shouldn't help people. He should. He already does. I'm saying the show has an opportunity to explore the tension between personal autonomy and moral responsibility in a way that isn't preachy. For example, Aldrich wanting to terminate the contract is self-protection. Aldrich protecting women in the tavern is communal protection. Both are valid. The show can let him struggle with the guilt of focusing on his own problems when others suffer. It can also let him struggle with resentment when his own life keeps getting hijacked by a world that refuses to handle its own ugliness. That resentment doesn't make him bad. It makes him human. Here's another reho question. If Aldrich can't even choose a quiet drink with his friends without being pulled into violence, what does freedom actually mean for him? Freedom might not be, "no one can force me." Freedom might be, "I can choose my obligations." That's a deeper kind of freedom, and it's hard to achieve in a coercive society. Now, I want to keep building on the idea that the show can stay coherent without revealing more plot. It can do that by developing its themes through different scenarios rather than through bigger twists. You can have scenes where Aldrich is forced to decide between confronting tyranny now or gathering information first. Scenes where Tessa and Duncan disagree about risk. Scenes where the town reacts with fear to Aldrich's power, even though he's helping. Scenes where House Alwyn's arrogance shows up in social humiliations rather than open violence. Scenes where the shadow curse appears again, reminding us that evil isn't only human. Those kinds of scenarios build a long-form arc naturally. They don't require shocking reveals. They require consistent character pressure. And that's the kind of storytelling that tends to age well. Twist-heavy shows get remembered for their twists. Character pressure shows get remembered for how they made you feel. Now, to keep this seamless and alive, I'll end this stretch on a thought that feels like the next natural place the story wants to go. Once Aldric has publicly refused tyranny, every powerful entity that benefits from silence, Baron Dubban, arrogant House Alwyn, and whoever is operating the shadows with assassination attempts and curses, has a reason to treat him not as a nobody anymore, but as a problem that needs to be managed.